Hey, I'm Max and welcome back to another devlog. In the last one, I made a prototype of a game where you are the monster and you go around fighting agents in suits while using powers like pulling yourself around with your hand and shooting. Many people seem interested to see more and I wanted to try pushing the idea a bit further, so I decided to try some more things. First, I thought the player needed more powers. Right now, the only offensive power you have does a single shot and it's pretty boring. I decided to make the classic fireball that almost every game has. I coded the logic for the projectile and damage on impact, and tried it with different effects from a pack I found, but as it turns out they were not very good looking. So instead I imported back the one I made for my previous game, and I think that looks a lot better. There seems to be an effect on the camera by default that makes it so when you are exposed to big lights, like the explosion from the fireball and then it is removed, your vision goes dark for a short time. At first I wanted to remove it, but since the game is using a first-person view, I feel like this effect is pretty realistic, because in real life when you are exposed to bright lights and then they go away, you kind of see dark for a bit. And it also adds a risk of blinding yourself if you use fireballs at short range. So a sort of downside to using a fireball. So I kinda like it. The next power I wanted to add was a laser beam because they are cool. So I used the laser beam from the pack I downloaded earlier, and also coded the logic so any enemies hit would get damaged. But something felt weird about the fireball and the laser beam, and that was because nothing was happening where it hit. So if I hit a wall or the ground, it didn't do anything. I added a fire effect on the ground and on the walls when you hit it with a fireball. I also made it spawn but smaller for the laser. It looked pretty cool, but I didn't want to leave it on forever, and just making it disappear after a couple seconds looked terrible. So in my code I created a dynamic material which allowed me to make it fade out over time, and it definitely looked a lot better. It's a lot more fun to use those spells when you leave big fire marks everywhere you hit. It really makes the player feel more powerful. Maybe it's better not to spawn the fire on enemies though. Obviously I can't let the player spam spells forever. There needs to be some kind of limit. I decided to go with the classic energy system, so using spells cost energy and energy regenerates passively over time. I could even add talents that speed up energy regen or reduce the energy cost of some spells. It's a good fit for the game I'm making, I think. Then I made it so when you beat enemies, they can drop an energy or health pack, which is obviously going to give you energy or health when you go over it. I thought this might encourage players to go into the action instead of staying back all of the time. Next, I made a spawner for the enemies so I can spawn them in a zone randomly from my code. To test it, I made them spawn every couple seconds, but I intend to make a mode with stronger and bigger waves of enemies. But before that, I think this Asian village I found on the marketplace is great, but there isn't much to grapple and most of it is open to enemy fires, so you can't hide anywhere. So I decided to make instead a city. I used an old asset from the forum that surprisingly still works in Unreal Engine 5, despite being a few years old, and it allows me to make roads easily. I also used buildings I got for free from Quaternius. I always use these models, they're low poly but they're always decent. Finally, I used trees from the marketplace asset. Because of them, I managed to make a pretty good looking city really fast and without making any models myself. That's really awesome. I put my enemy spawner in this city and it was pretty cool. The enemies were spawning and I was able to defeat them while grappling around. My enemies were breakdancing on the ground after getting knocked down. I guess they love the city so much that they want to dance. No, but for real, that was a bug, but I fixed it. The grapple in the city feels so good. There's a lot of places you can grab and pull yourself around. You can pull yourself very high up with the buildings. And the buildings are close enough that you can fly in between them and grab the other one. Then I added a way for me to easily create and spawn enemies with different weapons. Like one with a pistol that shoots slower and one with a machine gun that shoots faster, but with less accuracy. This way, when I add the wave mode, I can make stronger enemies spawn in higher waves. Using powers like grapple and fireball, you can easily move around and defeat large amounts of enemies, so the enemies can be strong and you can still win. I tried adding difficulty by making more enemies spawn, and well, it was definitely more difficult, but it was also very laggy and barely playable. So clearly making enemies spawn every second is not an option, so I coded the actual wave system, so enemies spawn in waves every minute. This made a lot more sense because it gave players the time to go and defeat the wave before the next one. In conclusion, the bee-hopping, grappling and wall running gives you great mobility, and the fireball and laser gives you great power. So with this you can easily move around, avoid enemy attacks while defeating them. However, I still need to add more types of enemies and more spells for the player to use, so it doesn't get too repetitive. I also need to create a level system so I can spawn enemies of higher level that will do more damage and have more HP, and also make the player level up from defeating enemies, so eventually the player will lose and have to try again after having leveled up a little bit. Stay tuned if you are interested.